As a full-time employee and advocate for Big Brothers Big Sisters, it is my special privilege to introduce our next author, Mark Kennedy Shriver. Mark is the Senior Vice President of U.S. Programs at Save the Children and has long been an advocate for social justice, particularly as it relates to young, at-risk kids. Most recently, Mark has published a great book about his wonderful father, titled A Good Man, Rediscovering My Father, Sargent Shriver. After a lifetime searching for the path to his father's success in the public arena, Mark instead turns to a search for the secret of his father's joy, Sargent's keen devotion to others, and his unique sense of purpose. Without further ado, Mark Shriver.
Good evening. Thank you, Pierce, for that very kind introduction. I appreciate it. To Maria and Neil and to my next-door neighbor, Dora, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I had to come all the way down to Houston to see Dora Bush, so it's nice to be with you. And I want to thank President and Mrs. Bush. It's really an honor to be here with you both this evening, and to thank Mrs. Bush in particular for your incredible commitment to family literacy in this country. There really is no stronger advocate in America on this important issue, and I'm honored to be here with you and your incredible family. So thank you very much, Mrs. Bush. You know, I thought there were a lot of Kennedys and Shrivers in the world. There are a lot of Bushes. I mean, I've never seen so many people in one family except for at a family reunion. And I'm getting the sense, and having conversations with Pierce and his sisters, that the Bushes can be a little competitive too. So when Neil called me up and asked me whether I would do this, of course I said absolutely, and then I hung up the phone before he changed his mind. And then being from a big Irish Catholic competitive family, the first thing you do when you get a nice honor like this is to call your siblings and rub it in. So I called up Maria. I said, Maria, you're not going to believe it. I've been invited to Houston. Neil Bush called me up. I'm doing the celebration of reading. They have 2,000 people. And she goes, are you kidding me? Neil Bush called me 2 weeks ago and asked me to give the speech. And I said, what are you talking about? And she goes, you know, you've written one bestseller. I've written like 5 or 6. I've lost track. You have 3 kids. I have 4 kids. I'm friends with Mrs. Bush and President Bush. You're not. So I hung up on Maria. So then I called my brother, Timmy, who has not written a book. And I said, Timmy, he's writing a book. He's the head of Special Olympics, and he's writing a book. I said, Timmy, you're not going to believe it. I've been invited to the celebration of reading. All the Bushes are going to be there. It's a huge honor going down to Houston. And he goes, are you kidding me? Neil Bush called and invited me to give the speech. And I said, well, you haven't even written a book. And he goes, I know, but I run Special Olympics. Vice President and Mrs. Bush came to the games in Notre Dame in 1987. Neil Bush thinks I'm much smarter than you. So I hung up on Timothy. So I called up Bobby, and I said, Bobby, you're not going to believe this. I've been invited to Houston. I think Maria's lying. I think Timmy's lying. And there's a pause, and he goes, I got a message here to call Neil Bush. So I guess I'm number 4, Neil. Thanks a million. I really appreciate it. I am honored to be in Texas. I mean, you know you're in Texas, right? President Bush, when you get in the elevator, and I'm feeling good about myself, and this guy gets in, and he's got the hat on and the boots, and he looks at me and goes, has anybody ever told you look like a Kennedy? And I said, yeah, once or twice. And he goes, damn, that must make you mad. And then I'm in a little reception beforehand, and everybody, of course, thinks, you're Kennedy, you're from Boston, you like the Patriots. I swear to God, I don't like the Patriots. I like the Texans. So don't yell at me anymore, okay? Everybody, we can't stand the Patriots. I said, I don't like the Patriots either. It's an honor, really, to be here with John Meacham and Mary Neal and Brad Thor. Last night I was eating dinner with my wife and our 3 kids, and our 15-year-old daughter, Molly, said, what are you doing in Houston? And I said, well, I'm going down there. Mrs. Bush has got this incredible commitment to family literacy. And Molly said, oh, that's wonderful, Daddy. You're working on getting kids to read all across America at Save the Children. That's a great match. And then I told Molly that I'm on the same program with John and Mary and Brad. And she paused and she said, Daddy, those are real writers. You wrote one book, and it's about Grandpa. I hope you're going to speak first. And then I said to her, actually, honey, I think I'm going last. And she said, you must have done something to upset the Bushes. You're going to bomb after those authors speak. And it is a little intimidating when you're sitting up there. There's no New York Times #1 bestseller on this book. I'm the only one that's a little different than the other ones. So with Molly's encouragement, I just want to say why I wrote the book. Okay. I have written only one book, and it's a book about my dad. And I wrote it shortly after he died because, as Pierce said, I wanted to figure out how this guy lived 95 years and did it with such joy. You know, the book is obviously called A Good Man, and, you know, Dad was hailed for being a so-called great man, for creating the Peace Corps, for running President Johnson's War on Poverty, Head Start, Legal Services for the Poor, Job Corps, foster grandparents, VISTA, spreading Special Olympics around the world with my mom. But what really touched me when I was sitting in the church at the wake were the comments not of the big shots or the TV or media, but the two waitresses from his favorite restaurant who waited in line and came up and almost simultaneously said, your father was a good man. And they turned around and walked out of the church. The guy at the U.S. air counter at National Airport who said, you know, some of the best moments in his life were walking my father, even though he had Alzheimer's, through the security line at National Airport. And he said, your father was a good man. The guy who picks up trash in our neighborhood a couple days after Dad died parked his trash truck, got out of the truck, and wiped his hands on his jacket and said, your father's a good man. And he turned around, got back in his truck, and drove away. And I realized through the repetition of that phrase, you know, at first I thought it was something you say when somebody's dad dies and whose mother had died 18 months earlier. But I realized that they meant something different. So I wanted to figure out what made him good and what made him so joyful. And I went back and looked at the letters that he wrote. You know, he wrote me almost every day when I was in high school. He'd slip them under the door. They could be about something that the Pope said. They could be about the dinner conversation. It could be about an Orioles victory over the Texas Rangers. It could be about a book by Elie Wiesel. And then he wrote me when I was in college as well. And actually, after I graduated and got married, I'd get a letter or two every day. The man wrote voraciously, and he read voraciously. And I dug into those letters, some of which I honestly never read, because I thought, oh my God, you know, I get home from work and think that my father had lost his mind. 2 more letters and put them in a file. And I distilled down after reading those letters and reading a bunch of speeches that he gave, that the 3 principles that defined his life were his faith in God, and it was a faith that demanded acts of hope and love. It was a faith that sustained him through the Depression when their family lost what money they had, and to work himself through high school, through college, and through Yale Law School, all on scholarships. It was a faith that sustained him through brutal combat in World War II. He graduated from Yale and the next day went into the Navy before Pearl Harbor. And he wrote about, in these letters, surviving battles of Guadalcanal and Santa Cruz and cleaning up the remains of his friends off the deck of the USS South Dakota. It was a faith that demanded these acts of hope and love. I mentioned, obviously, the Peace Corps, and before that, his work to integrate the Catholic schools and the Catholic hospitals in Chicago. And then the creation under President Johnson of programs like VISTA. And he loved to work, you know, bipartisanly. He was so proud that Governor Romney of Michigan was the honorary chair of VISTA, and that Mrs. Reagan was engaged in foster grandparents. And President and Mrs. Bush, when you came to Notre Dame, you were the highest ranking official to ever go to a Special Olympic Games in 1987. And Dad was so very proud of the connection that you shared going to Yale and playing baseball, but your commitment here in Texas and across the country to Special Olympics, he was so proud of. But you see these things all as, I saw them all as acts of hope, acts of love. And the best act of love was his marriage to my mom of 56 years. I guess the Bushes have passed him, but that relationship for 56 years. They dated for 7 years, so maybe they catch up to you. And then as a son, you know, trying to figure out by writing this book how to balance these different pieces of a commitment to God. You know, my dad went to Mass every day of his life. And I don't mean like every other day or every third day, I mean every day. And when we traveled, the first question he'd ask when you check into a hotel is, what's the mass schedule and where's the local mass? And I wanted to figure out how a guy could be happily married for 56 years, raise 5 kids, all of whom love him, go to mass every day, be eulogized by President Clinton and Vice President Biden, have Stevie Wonder singing, Bono singing at the funeral, and still be able to touch the waitresses, the guy who picks up the trash, the people who will clean up this place after we leave here. And that's why I wrote the book. I'll just tell you one last story. My dad had Alzheimer's for the last 10 years of his life, and I had the privilege of taking care of him medically and legally for those last 10 years. And about 5 years before he died, as you all know, Alzheimer's is a brutal disease. It's financially and emotionally devastating. And we were stuck at a light. Dora knows the intersection of Bradley and 7 Locks. I remember it like it was yesterday. And he was lucid, I thought, and I turned to him and I said, I don't know why I asked it. I said, Dad, you're losing your mind. How does that make you feel? And without missing a beat, he said, I'm doing the best I can with what God has given me. And I realized through writing this book, which is really just a series of stories trying to figure out that faith, that hope, that love that instilled such joy in him, how he did do that, whether it was in joyous moments like the Peace Corps or Head Start or Special Olympics with my mom or, sad times like Alzheimer's or planning President Kennedy's funeral when Jackie Kennedy called him up and asked him to do it. He did it because that's what faith did, and that was the gifts that God had given him on that Friday afternoon when he had 3 little kids and a wife who was pregnant with a 4th one, me. So what do all these stories about faith and hope and love have to do with family literacy? What does the story of a 95-year-old man who never won an election, who actually got crushed in the 2 elections he ran in, who battled Alzheimer's for 10 years, who wasn't a titan of industry or a political potentate. What does it have to do with all of us gathered here tonight? I think my father would have loved tonight. He would have loved the energy in this room. He would have been so happy that there were almost 2,000 people talking about family literacy. He would have been thrilled with Mrs. Bush's longtime commitment to family literacy and the fact that she is surrounded by a loving and supportive family. He would want to know more about the letter writing campaign that the foundation is running right now called Devotedly Dad. And I bet he would have entered that contest. He would have wanted details about the new initiative that Maria and Neil announced this evening. How many kids are you going to serve? How are you going to train the tutors? How are you going to evaluate how those kids are doing? And I think my dad would have loved the fact that you're all here tonight trying to help others. He knew he didn't win the war on poverty. He knew that his vision for the Peace Corps never materialized, and he knew that Special Olympics hadn't reached all the people that it could across the world. But he kept pushing. He kept trying because his faith demanded it. His faith demanded acts of hope and love. And I think he would have been joy-filled tonight because the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy is just that. It's an act of hope. It's an act of love that's trying to make a difference in people's lives. So thank you for honoring my dad, for honoring goodness, for honoring trying, and thank you for helping families in the battle against illiteracy, and in so doing, to spread faith, hope, and love. Thank you.